Boone and Vivian back with us today. At the same time, we've got some that are away. Lavinia's been coughing this morning and has got a bad headache. And also Judy sent a text to say that she's got a gastro infection, so that's why they're not here either. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 8, the Apostle Paul said to the Christians in the city of Corinth that he had been a robber of churches. And I referred to that passage in last week's sermon. If you'd never read that passage before, you could wonder whether Paul was confessing to being a criminal, having committed some criminal offence, but he wasn't. He was explaining his action to the Corinthians. As I explained last week, when Paul was originally there, he spent 8 months preaching the gospel and establishing the church there in Corinth, and he had not taken any payments from them. Instead, for a while, he worked to earn an income, and then he was provided with funds from the churches of Macedonia. So why did he say that he robbed other churches? Well, these churches had sent support to Paul, and Paul may have been pointing out that even though they were giving him money, he wasn't giving them any benefit. He wasn't making any return to them in terms of work. Rather, he was taking what they were giving to him and using it for the benefit of the Corinthians. But after all, that is what the money was given to him for. As I pointed out a week ago, Paul was coming under criticism from some false teachers that were trying to take over the church in Corinth. And for instance, we saw him use phrases such as, "Forgive me this wrong, and I took you in by deceit." And it appears with those phrases, Paul wasn't actually speaking of a wrong, rather he was speaking ironically, referring to accusations of deceit and so forth, which were being made against him. And so it could well be that when Paul here says, "I robbed other churches," maybe he's borrowing the language of his accusers and throwing it back in their faces. You see, this whole issue of Paul's support was being turned against him, and they were alleging that he had some plot regarding the Corinthian congregation, especially in view of the fact that he was writing to them about a contribution to be taken up for the churches back in Judea. Maybe there were allegations that he was going to misappropriate those funds or something like that. But whatever be the accusations, the point is that Paul conducted himself with integrity. And furthermore, what it tells us is that Paul was supported in his work by other congregations, and this raises the idea of supporting missionaries, and that's what I want to talk about today. The idea of supporting God's workers in other places. Now, there are various estimates as to when Saul of Tarsus, who later became known as Paul, became a convert to Christianity. Those estimates range from about AD 35 through to about AD 40. In other words, something like perhaps 5 to 10 years after Christianity was established. And between the time of his conversion and the time of what we call his first missionary journey. He was initially in the city of Damascus, where he first became a Christian. He visited Arabia, he says, which was to the east and to the south of Palestine. And then he returned to Damascus, and that, according to Galatians, took up about 3 years. He then went to Jerusalem. He spent a short time there preaching the gospel before heading back up to Tarsus, where he began his life. As I said, he was known as Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus is located in the southeastern region of what is Turkey, near the northeastern region of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, during this period of time, a Gentile congregation was established in Syrian Antioch up towards the corner of the Mediterranean, and Barnabas was sent to work there with that new congregation. Barnabas went over to Tarsus, which was not far away, found Paul and brought Paul back to Syrian Antioch, and the two of them worked together there. Somewhere around AD 44, Paul and Barnabas took aid from the church in Syrian Antioch down to the famine-affected Christians in Jerusalem. And then between AD 44 and 48, Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey, which you'll read about in Acts 13 and 14. And that took them through the island of Cyprus and then up to the southern central region of what is now Turkey. Nothing is said about their financial support during this time, but it's likely that, as with other apostles, they were supported quite possibly by the church in Syrian Antioch. And in fact, if you come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul there talks about the basis of supporting preachers and teachers in regard to the gospel. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 3, my defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? Now what he's saying there is, don't we have a right to have food? Don't we have a right to support a wife? Do we not have the right to concentrate fully upon the preaching of the gospel rather than having to work to earn our income? And he's saying that the other apostles and others have this right. He says in verse 7, who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not consume some of the milk of the flock? I am not just asserting these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does the law, and he's talking about the Old Testament law, does the law not say these things as well? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while it is threshing. In other words, you were to allow an animal to feed even whilst it was working for you. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking entirely for our sake? Yes, it was written for our sake, because the ploughman ought to plough in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing in the crops. In other words, the workers benefited from that. They received an income. Verse 11, if we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. just as back in the Old Testament, the priests and the Levites benefited from the offerings that the people made. Part of those offerings was used to support the priests and the Levites. So Paul says here that those who concentrate on the preaching of the gospel can receive their living, their income, if you like, through that sort of work. So that's the basis for support. After the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas were sent by the church in Syrian Antioch down to Jerusalem to deal with a doctrinal issue that had been created by some false teachers. And then Paul went out on his second missionary journey. This time he set out from Syrian Antioch with Silas. He went round the corner into Turkey and was heading across Turkey. He met up with Timothy, and Timothy joined the work and began, if you like, an apprenticeship with Paul. They continued over to the Aegean. They were then joined for a while by Luke. Then they sailed across the Aegean Sea, coming to Macedonia. They travelled through Macedonia down to Achaia, which we would refer to as southern Greece. And that entire second missionary journey may have lasted from autumn AD 49 through to autumn AD 53. And it was during that time that the issue of Paul's support and his finances arose on a couple of occasions. First of all, it arose in the city of Thessalonica. After crossing the Aegean, Paul and his fellow workers first came to Neapolis. They went on to establish a congregation in Philippi in Acts chapter 16, and then they travelled southwest down to Thessalonica in the early part of Acts chapter 17. And although nothing is said about it in the book of Acts, Paul indicates in his letters to the Thessalonians that he was at that time running short of support. And there's a couple of references, one of them in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 9. And he says this, 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9, "For you recall, brothers and sisters, our labour and hardship. It was by working night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you that we proclaimed to you the gospel of God." So there's the idea of labour and hardship there. There's the idea of working night and day. There's the idea of not wanting to be a burden upon the Thessalonians. After all, these were people who were just in the process of being led to the gospel. Now, when you come over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul adds a little bit more information beginning in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 6. "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from every brother who leads a disorderly life, and not one in accordance with the tradition in which you received from us." Now that word disorderly there in the Greek can have the meaning of idleness. And there is evidence for that from documents written about that time. So Paul here speaks against idleness. Verse 7, For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined way among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labour and hardship. So there you've got that idea, labour and hardship, along with paying for their food. We kept working night and day so that we would not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have a right to this, he's already talked about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but in order to offer ourselves as a role model for you, so that you would follow our example. For even when we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat. For we hear that some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. Now we command and exhort such persons in the Lord Jesus Christ to work peacefully and eat their own bread. So Paul, yes, he could have asked for support, but he didn't do so. Instead, they worked day and night. They laboured so as not to be a burden, not to impose upon the Thessalonians, but rather so that they could pay for their own food. What does all of that indicate to us? That Paul, running short of funds, had to do some other work in order to have an income to survive and to keep on preaching the gospel. That's the first example when he reaches Thessalonica during his second missionary journey. He then goes on from there. They go further southwest to Berea and preach there in Acts 17. And then Paul leaves Silas and Timothy in Berea, and he himself goes on to Athens and preaches the gospel there. We read about that in Acts 17. Then he leaves Athens and he goes down to Corinth. And here again, the issue of support arises, and you can read about that in the early verses of Acts, the 18th chapter, which we'll come to in just a moment. And it's from the events that take place there during that first time that he was in Corinth that these later comments are made about him not imposing upon them and not accepting support from them and so forth. And I read various passages about this last week. For instance, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 11. Up to this present hour we are both hungry and thirsty, and are poorly clothed, and are roughly treated, and homeless, and we labour working with our own hands. So Paul indicates there were times when he was on a very reduced income, shall we say, and it was necessary for him to work. And he's not there talking about the work of preaching the gospel and getting paid by the Corinthians, because he made it very clear he did not accept pay from the Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 7, did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preach the gospel of God to you without charge? Or chapter 12 and verse 13, for in what respect were you treated as inferior to the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not become a burden to you? So here's Paul, he's in Corinth, but he makes it very clear that he's not seeking support from the Corinth. And he's talking back at that time when he was with them, establishing the church, preaching the gospel during his second missionary journey. Now, we've already seen that earlier in Thessalonica, Paul was running short of funds and having to work day and night to keep preaching. When we come to Acts 18, we see the same thing there. Acts 18 verse 1, after these events, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, and Claudius was the Roman emperor at the time, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together, for they were tent makers by trade. So Paul, not having any more financial support, worked for a time making tents, and in that society, tents were a very necessary thing for many. Verse 4, and Paul was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Paul was limited by the fact that he was having to do other work to bring in an income so that he could eat and so forth. And that limited him to preaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, the sixth day, which was the equivalent of our Saturday. And that, incidentally, is not teaching Sabbath day worship. You've got abundance of evidence there to show that they did not follow Sabbath day worship, and we've talked about that in the past on various occasions. What was going on here? He needed an income. He needed to survive. He didn't want to depend upon the Corinthians. They were only just in the process of becoming Christians, and the church was in the process of being established. So rather than impose upon them, what did he do? He worked to bring in an income until something else happened. Now remember, when he'd left Berea, he'd left Silas and Timothy there. So Acts 18 and verse 5, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So somehow the arrival of Silas and Timothy enabled him to focus again on the work of evangelism. Paul gives you a bit more of an explanation to that years later when he writes 2 Corinthians, the letter, and we've got these comments in 2 Corinthians 11 verses 8 and 9. I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brothers came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need, and in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you, and will continue to do so. So they had brought donations from the churches in Macedonia, enabling Paul now to go full time once again in the work of evangelism. If you come over to the book of Philippians chapter 4, you'll find that Philippi was one of the churches that sent support to Paul and went on sending support. This letter to Philippi is one of what we call the prison epistles, written by Paul from Rome, perhaps somewhere around AD 62. And Paul looks back. He's just received help from the Philippians, and he thanks them for that, and also points out to them that they've helped him in the past, and he's grateful for that. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15, you yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you alone. For even in Thessalonica you sent a gift more than once to my need. So remember I said that Paul was struggling even when he got to Thessalonica. Gone Philippi to Thessalonica, he was short of funds there. The Philippian church, which had only just been established, was sending him what support they could even at that time. Verse 17, not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek the profit which increases to your account. But I have received everything in full, and have an abundance, and am amply supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you have sent. And he's talking here about the more recent gift that they have sent to him. And he describes that as a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. So the Philippians, right from the establishment of that congregation, had engaged in support. So here you have this principle stated and illustrated of the church supporting workers as they go out to preach the gospel and to evangelize. But there's another indication of support which can be easily overlooked. And that's right at the end of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 28 and verses 30 and 31. Acts chapter 28 verses 30 and 31. This is some years after Paul's second missionary journey. Now Paul stayed 2 full years in his own rented lodgings and welcomed all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching things about the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness, unhindered. So what happened was Paul completed his second missionary journey. he went on to carry out a third missionary journey. When he got back to Jerusalem after that third missionary journey, he was seized by a mob intent on killing him. They were making false accusations. He was taken into custody by the Romans and held by the Romans for 2 years. He went through a number of hearings, none of which found him guilty. In the end, he asked for his right as a Roman citizen to have his case heard by Caesar. That is granted. So he goes by ship to Rome. You'll read about that in Acts chapter 27. Then he arrives in Rome, and it says here in the passage I read that he spent 2 years waiting for his case to be heard. Now, he wasn't idle during that time. It says that he stayed in his own rented lodgings, welcoming all who came to him, preaching and teaching them. But notice there's a phrase there, his own rented lodgings. Where did Paul get the money to rent lodgings? The indication is that he was kept in house detention. Now, what we've seen over the previous 15 years of Paul carrying out his various missionary travels and so forth, that he was supported by other congregations, and if that ran short, he would go out and work to carry on an income. So there's no indication that he was self-funding, that he had plenty of money himself. Now, some have suggested, well, maybe the Romans allowed him to work during the 2 years. It's possible. We haven't got any indication of that. Some writers say it's not likely that he would have been allowed to do that. Another possibility somebody raised is maybe he received an inheritance during that time. Maybe his parents died or something. Well, again, that's just supposition. We don't know that that's the case. I'll put to you a third possibility. For the previous 15 years or so, Paul had been supported by other churches in the work of preaching and teaching. And yes, he's under house detention here, but what's he still doing? He's still preaching and teaching. And so it may well be that he was able to have rented quarters because the church was still supporting him. Maybe the church in Rome, maybe the church in other places as well, because we know from the book of Philippians that they were still sending help to him, because the book of Philippians was written during that 2 years in Rome, along with other books as well. So we have here the model, if you like, of workers being supported by churches. So we come to our present situation. For some time we've talked about supporting Varney Igo, who works with the church in Cairns. We first raised this a couple of years back, and then were interrupted by COVID, and then we revived it again, and we've talked a bit more about that. On the back there, the latest happenings, you've got some pictures there with Varney baptising some people. As you know, Lavinia and I had a week's holiday up in Cairns, and on Monday, August 21st, we sat down at a coffee shop with Varney and spent a couple of hours talking to him, finding out more about him. I've also found out more about Varney previously from various people who know him. Varney is married. I'll show you some pictures shortly. Varney is married. His wife's name is Mildred. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. They come from New Guinea. They moved to Cairns in 2016. Varney, among other things, was an elder with the church in New Guinea. During his time in Cairns, Varney has baptised 38 people there. He also regularly goes back to PNG, as I'm going to say, and has baptised quite a lot of people there. For some years there in Cairns, he was principally supported by his wife. And she said she would do that in order to allow him to focus on evangelism. Varney tries to visit PNG, Papua New Guinea, about 4 times a year, 3 weeks at a time. He's still got some of his family back in PNG. He does preaching trips there. He occasionally goes to Fiji, and he mentioned various people that this congregation knows of in Fiji. Warren and Diane were in Fiji a few years back. He has preached in Townsville and Charters Towers in Queensland. You may not have heard of him. There's a Christian named Graham Hoffer. He's been in the church a long, long time. Has lived in Victoria. What he does is spends 6 months a year, the cooler months in the dry season, up in Cairns, and helps the church there. Basically, Varney does the evangelising, and Graham then focuses upon building on the foundation of the teaching and so forth. So Graham spends about 6 months up there, and then in the summer months comes back down to Bairnsdale, which is in Victoria. The Cairns church has around 48 members. Brian, could you, rather than me, if you could just bring the pictures up, and then if you could change them from there when I say so. We had a whole lot of pictures from Varney, and Ving took a whole lot of pictures while we were up there. I've only downloaded a few because of time. But here, first of all, this gives you an idea of where we're talking about. Right up there in Cairns, it's up in the tropics. And there's Brisbane, there's Sydney, there's churches in various places, I know in Rocky, Bundaberg and so forth. All I can remember is Brisbane to Cairns, I think from memory by road, is about 1,600 kilometres. So it gives you some idea of the distance involved. Flying there from Sydney about 2.5 hours or so to get up there. So it's a long way up the road. Brian, if I could have the next one, please. That gives you a bit more of a close-up there. You can see Cairns right on the top of the map there. Below that is Townsville with this congregation there. I think I mentioned Charters Towers, didn't I, a while ago, that he has preached in Charters Tower. He has, and you can see Charters Towers south of Townsville. Bob Marks used to preach up at Townsville. I know there's some that know Bob Marks, then Rocky and so forth. Now these islands here that you see, this is all part of the Great Barrier Reef. Again, just an idea of where things are. The next one, please, Brian. All right, here's Cairns. We've got the Pacific Ocean sort of coming out from here. Lavinia and I stayed, I think it was somewhere down this road or something. The church in Cairns is located, I can't remember which road, one of these roads going back down here. Cairns is surrounded, you've got mountains out there to the west, and a lot of the area is sugarcane around there, and then beyond that, rainforest. And even, I remember the first day we were there, you might see this is all mud here. We don't have sand, but it's old mangroves. And when we were walking along here somewhere, it said, do not go near the water, crocodiles. So everywhere you go in Cairns and around Cairns, they say crocodiles. All right, next picture. Okay, there's a shot from another angle. So again, you've got the city area here, and then you've got all the suburbs stretching out there. And I should have written down the population. I've forgotten it. But all of these boats, you can do cruises out to the Great Barrier Reef. It's about an hour's journey out of here. So that gives you some idea of the Cairns itself. Next one, please, Brian. Okay, now this, I said the Varney comes from, I have a habit of just saying PNG, Papua New Guinea. The church in Australia has been involved with evangelism in PNG for a long time, going back to 1970 and before that. And I've known various people. In fact, David Payne, who some of you have met, David spent time working up there. Places like Port Moresby, which is the capital, Lae, you can see up near the Gulf there, Goroka there, and I seem to remember that there was a church at Mount Hagen. And also this is very mountainous country, so there's also villages tucked away in the mountains, and the only way you can get to them is to trek. And so people like David Payne have been back from time to time, and they'll trek through the country there, visiting some of the more remote places. There's the top end of Australia just there. Okay, Brian, the next one, please. Now, I said too that Varney makes occasional trips to Fiji, as well as going back to PNG. In fact, Varney was going to be making a trip to Fiji this month. But so you've got Cairns up around here, New Guinea up here, and you've got Fiji over here. So he's sort of doing mission work through that southwestern region of the Pacific. Next, please. That's Varney. That's Barney sitting at the table. All right. Is it possible just to tilt that camera just a little bit to bring his head into the picture? I'm just wondering if you just tilt back into the camera.
Yeah,
Project it.
it's not the camera, it's the computer.
I can tell you there was a nice.
That's a better one.
All right. All right, we'll skip the other one. That's Varney and his wife and two of his children. Others of the children are back living in PNG. But there is a sizable New Guinea population living in Cairns, and I guess other parts of northern Australia as well. And so Varney has ready access to that community. They use him for certain cultural things, particularly relating to funerals. Now there's certain PNG traditions, and Varney is often called in to help with those things, and that gives him an opportunity to preach the gospel there. But not only does he preach amongst New Guinea people, but he's taught Australians and baptised Australians as well. Let me try the next one, Brian, please. Okay, these are some links of people from here. All right, that's Varney. Varney's in the middle, and these are two New Guinea people in traditional dress. So that's what their legs look like in traditional dress. And there's one more picture, I think. All right, that's a close-up of two people. This scene shows Varney preaching to a group of people in PNG by a river. So up there, is this what they mean by part of the computer stuff being in the clouds? Above this is a whole group of people by the banks of the river, and that's what Varney does. Each time he goes back to PNG, He gets together with people and preaches the gospel and so forth. So not only is he preaching the gospel, thanks Brian, that's it. Not only is he preaching and teaching in Cairns, but he's also carrying out mission work around that region of the Pacific as well. So what we're talking about is once a month sending some financial help to the church up in Cairns, and Varney said particularly what that would help with is again allowing him to make some of these other trips that he makes. He has got some support coming in, but that is limited. Some of that support is on a year-by-year basis. Some of the support is only for a period of 2 years, and so on. So what we can do to help would be very much appreciated there. And the idea is that the last Sunday of the month, which is two weeks from now for this month, put aside what we can, and we'll talk about how to do that, and then send that off to the church and make it available to Barney. So what you're seeing is a modern day application of the principle taught in the New Testament. Jesus said to his disciples the gospel was to go into the whole world, not just part of it. So our duty doesn't begin and end simply with the Bankstown region. I like what they do in Victoria. In Victoria, they have a kingdom concept in that rather than just focusing upon local work for each congregation, they also think collectively of what they can do throughout Melbourne and throughout Victoria. In England, you get used to the idea of a parish, a church parish, and some traditional church, denominational churches use that term here, and the parish is the area where that congregation's members come from. We need to think beyond parish. Yes, we focus on the Bankstown region with however many suburbs, I've forgotten now, 18 suburbs or something like that. But there's a whole world beyond that. There's a whole city beyond that, and so forth. So one way that we can extend our efforts and enable the work of preaching and teaching and the building up of churches is to do what I've just talked about. We can contribute to the work of Varney in teaching and baptizing and building up congregations in various places. And not only that, incidentally, Varney also sometimes goes out to other places in Queensland preaching the gospel, and in fact he's planning, well, he's been invited to be the keynote speaker at camp here in Sydney at, I think, the end of December, beginning of January. So I'm just wondering if maybe we could get him here at that time. But let me add to that and say not only financial support, but also even taking the time to go up and be part of that. You can get some good prices if you like Lavinia and you search thoroughly. There are some really good prices for trips up to Cairns, and you could go up there and be part of the congregation for a week or so, help even with the work there, be an encouragement and so forth. And same thing with PNG. Warren and I went over to Fiji. We can extend our thinking, and instead of going to Manly for 2 weeks every January, pop up to the tropical north and be an encouragement to Christians up there. So that's the message for us, is that the gospel needs to be proclaimed. It's very limited if you haven't got much of an income. And if you have to work for your own income, that limits the time that can be given. So churches can and did help the preaching of the gospel, and that's something that we can go on with as well. Let's stand and sing.